So, Shirish, we have a wide range of people. Some are participants in SAC, some are people working on hardware things, some people working on software things. Please feel free to introduce yourself and then dive straight into the talk. We can go on. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for my talk, which is about how to achieve product market fit. As you might imagine, achieving product market fit is really essential for any startup to succeed, the lack of which will surely doom your startup. Let me introduce myself and talk a little bit about my background. So I've been in the Seattle area for the last 30 plus years. Started pretty early on at Microsoft in 1987 in the good old days of MS-DOS. I was responsible for introducing Microsoft's email products when local area networks were not even that widespread. And then I was responsible for the product strategy for MSN on the web. I did the Hotmail acquisition for Microsoft and also got Microsoft into the search business and launched MSN.com, which became one of the top web portals. And then in 1999, I left Microsoft and started my journey as a serial entrepreneur. My first company was in the mobile email space in the early days of BlackBerry and was eventually acquired by BlackBerry. And the technology we built became the foundation for BlackBerry Internet Email, which serviced over 50 million users at its peak. And then I was with BlackBerry for a number of years, launching a number of their products, and then started my second company, which was called LimeMocha in 2007. It was a pioneer in the space of social language learning, and by that, what I mean is that everyone was not only a student but also a teacher, and so we allowed you to connect with native speakers around the world and learn, from them as well as teach others your native language. And LimeMocha grew to over 15 million users around the world before being acquired by Rosetta Stone. Quick plug for my new book, which is coming out next week on August 24th. It's called From Startup to Exit, an insider's guide to launching and scaling your tech business. It is designed for early stage entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs who really want to understand the overall journey. I cover topics all the way from ideation to achieving product market fit, which we're talking about today, to fundraising, to launching and scaling your company, and then ultimately achieving an exit through an acquisition or an IPO. So hope if you're interested, you can order it from Amazon or any other bookstore. Somebody had a question about, is it software or hardware or both? Really what I cover is tech businesses. My background is software. But I think many of the principles I talk about apply for hardware startups as well. By the way, I'd like to make this interactive as possible, and feel free to ask questions as we go along, and then as appropriate, I will stop and take your questions. Otherwise, I might, if I'm going to cover the topic later on, I might take the question later on in the presentation. All right, so let's define the term product market fit. The term was originally defined by Andy Radcliffe, who was a partner at Benchmark and a well-known entrepreneur, but really popularized by Mark Andreessen. And his definition is product market fit means being in a good market with a product that can satisfy the market. But essentially, it's a situation in which you've identified really a deep issue or pain point that a customer is facing, and you have a solution that uniquely addresses that need in the marketplace, and customers are really clamoring for your product. The road to product market fit can be long. Netflix is a great example. Obviously, today I'm sure all of you are using Netflix at home. It's a very successful company. But if you read the book by the founder of one of the co-founders of Netflix, he writes about how long it took them to find product market fit. Initially, they would offer a few DVDs for free, after which you would have to rent out each DVD. And while they had a number of signups for the free DVDs, virtually nobody reordered after that. And it took them many, many failed experiments. And only when they tried the unique combination of no due dates, no late fees, and subscription, that ultimately the model worked. And in fact, I recall that time as well, because I would go to my local Hollywood video store and get DVDs from there. But I got really tired of paying late fees, and that's ultimately what convinced me to sign up for Netflix subscription. And so that combination of their offering really made the difference. And as the quote says here, it was a winner, and the engagement soared, the signups soared, the churn went down dramatically. So anyway, I would highly recommend the book by Mark Randolph. It's a very entertaining book and talks about the first few years of Netflix before Reed Hastings really took over as the CEO. So how do you know what product market fit looks like? There's some metrics that Andrew Chen, who's a very famous blogger, has shared here that I think is instructive. So for consumer products, you want to see, usage every other day, if not every day. You want to see organic growth, not paid growth, but organic growth of hundreds of signups a day, a clear path to 100,000 users, and a strong retention curve. And I'll talk more about retention cohorts and as a key metric later on my presentation. But you want to see not a steep, but a retention curve that stabilizes after some period of time, and that you're able to retain, at least 40 to 50% of your users over time. For SaaS products, you want to see a good conversion rate, which is typically 3 to 5% at least from free to paid. You want to see an LTV to CAC ratio of 3 to 5 times, and I'll define what those terms are. So CAC is customer acquisition cost, LTV is the lifetime value of the customer, which is the profitability of that customer over their lifetime. And that's a metric that a lot of VCs will look at. That's a key question they'll ask when you're out there pitching for your product. So if you're spending, $5 to acquire a customer, for example, you want to achieve at least $15 of profitability, not $15 of revenue, but $15 of profitability to have a good business. And then you want to see churn rates that are under 2%, and a clear path to 100K monthly recurring revenue, which is a good point at which you can raise a Series A fundraise. The one thing that I want to emphasize, especially for people who raise a boatload of money, is that user growth does not equate to product market fit. I'll give you an example of company called Branch Out, which came out in the 2012, 2013 timeframe. They raised a significant amount of money. And essentially their value proposition was they were trying to create a LinkedIn on top of Facebook. And at that time, the Facebook Open Graph was widely accessible, and you could essentially spam your friends, or the application could spam your friends on your behalf. And so they grew very rapidly, spamming, signing up people and then spamming their friends. But they didn't really have a value proposition that resonated with end users. And you can see that they had very steep growth, but because they didn't really retain their users, that petered out. And eventually the company had to pivot to something different. But they raised over $50 million. And unfortunately, the VCs forgot to ask a key question, which is, what does your retention look like? And they were able to raise $50 million of funding without the VCs doing proper due diligence on the retention of their user base. So before we talk about the specifics of the process by which you want to achieve product market fit, I would like to kind of approach this from a strategic perspective, which is really understanding the marketplace that you are entering and understanding who are the incumbents in the market and how entrenched they are. And I can tell you from my personal experience, having worked at Microsoft, that incumbents are incredibly hard to displace. We all know about the success that Microsoft Office has achieved and how it's the market standard, and whatever 95+% of people are using Microsoft Office. But I'm sure most of you don't remember the days of MS-DOS, when in fact the market was marketplace incumbents were Lotus 123, WordPerfect, and DBase, not Microsoft Word, not Microsoft Excel. At that time, Multiplan, before Excel became available. And I recall in those days that Microsoft tried very, very hard to displace the incumbents, Lotus 123, for example, but didn't succeed, even though they had better products on MS-DOS. And that is because people were used to the keystroke interface. They had invested in Lotus 123 macros, and became super hard to displace these incumbents. And it was only when Windows came out, first, Windows 3.0, which was the first successful version of Windows in 1992, that Microsoft really had the opportunity to displace these incumbents. And what happened, as you may recall, is that all the incumbents first were late in supporting Windows. They didn't want to do anything to make Windows successful. And when they realized that Windows was becoming successful, they simply ported their app to Windows and did not really take advantage of the full Windows GUI capabilities. Whereas Microsoft, not surprisingly, engineered its applications to take full advantage of the Windows platform. And so over time, what happened was customers really gravitated towards Microsoft applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc. And then eventually Microsoft made the brilliant move to bundle these applications together into Office, and then the rest was history. So incumbents, as I mentioned earlier, are very hard to displace. Really, the opportunity to displace them and achieve success, product market fit, is when there is a technology innovation or a platform shift. So as we discussed, when we moved from DOS to Windows, or when the internet became available and Amazon came on stream and they displaced Barnes Noble, and then mobile came on stream initially with BlackBerry, and then eventually as an application platform with iOS and Android. And then you had companies like OfferUp, which is a local company here, which went up against Craigslist. and they simplified the whole process of uploading your second-hand items and selling them, in the marketplace. And then eventually, when cloud became, widespread, you had the success story of Snowflake, which went IPO fairly recently, in one of the biggest IPOs for a software company, and they basically took advantage of the shift to cloud to build a data warehouse product that really displaced all the incumbents in the marketplace. The other opportunity to displace incumbents and achieve product market fit is when there are global macro trends that are happening that you can take advantage of. And here I'll talk about the Limoca story, which came out in 2007. And that was a time when globalization was happening rapidly. Broadband internet was prevalent, and you had social networking being successful with Facebook and Twitter, etc. And so we, as I described earlier, pioneered the notion of social language learning, where we built a community of users around the world in literally 200 different countries, and eventually grew to 15 million users, grew very rapidly because we took advantage of this global macro trend of globalization, where a billion plus people were interested in learning English and other foreign languages. I'll talk about Limoca a little bit later on, but today, of course, key macro trend is with COVID is remote work, and you've seen the success of companies like Zoom. There are a number of other companies that are focused on enabling remote work. Online commerce has really taken off, and you're seeing a number of direct-to-consumer brands that are coming out and becoming successful. So those are the two main opportunities. One is when there is a technology platform evolution or platform shift, or there's some global macro trend that you can take advantage of, and that allows you to bring new solutions to marketplace that can solve problems in a really unique fashion. All right, so let's assume that you have taken advantage of some global macro trend of platform shift. You still have to make sure that your solution really addresses the needs of the marketplace. And so there's a defined process that you need to go through. First of all, really understanding what the problem space is. Oftentimes, technologists will make the mistake of thinking that the problem they have is a problem that everyone has, and they'll build a solution, and then when they launch the product in the market, it falls flat on its face because they haven't really done the research to understand whether the problem that they think they have is a problem that everybody else has, or is there enough of a market out there. So you need to go through the problem hypothesis, then formulate your solution, and then engage in customer research, customer interviews. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Make sure that the problem that you're addressing is resonating with customers. Your solution is also resonating with customers. And then you would go build your MVP. You would then analyze the kind of engagement, retention that you're getting, and then either iterate further on the product or pivot if your product is not really resonating with your customers, and go back through that circle again of really understanding the problem, refining your solution, etc. So let me go a little bit deeper into that process. So the first thing I recommend before you even test the market is to conduct customer interviews. At least interview 25 plus customers, and then do market surveys to validate some of the learnings that you're getting from your customer interviews. And the thing that I want to really emphasize here, which a lot of people make the mistake, is don't present the solution first. Ask your customer what their top 3 problems are. And if the problem that you're addressing is in their top 3 problems, great news, because then you have a problem that they're really going to spend time on. Because if your problem that you're addressing is a problem for them, but it's number 10 on their list, on even number 5 on the list, they're simply not going to spend the time really understanding your product. They might, you might conduct an interview in which they say, hey, yeah, this is a problem we're having. Your solution looks great, and you go ahead and build that solution, and then you introduce the product to the market, and you find that it falls flat on its face because there are 3 or 4 other problems that are consuming your customers' time. So really, before you spend time presenting your solution, make sure that your problem that you are addressing is one of the top 3 problems that they're having. And then obviously understand what solutions are they currently using. Are there solutions available in the market that they're using today? Or better yet, maybe they've cobbled together some internal hack to solve that problem. And that's a great sign that you have a problem space that is being, a big problem for the customer. The other thing that you want to understand is the user satisfaction with the solution that they're using today. And obviously, the market that you want to address is a market where there's a high pain point or user need, and there is significant dissatisfaction with the competition, or that the platform shift or technology evolution lets you build a far superior solution to the problem. So, for example, today, one of the key technologies that has emerged in the last 3 or 4 years is AI ML. And that is allowing a number of new companies to emerge in the market that can solve the existing problems in a much better way. So that's again a situation where it's a lot easier for you to achieve product market fit. And then what I recommend is that even before you actually build a prototype or build a solution, that you test your value proposition with Google SEM or Facebook ads, and really understand what is the, you can test different messaging, and you can see what messaging is resonating with your customers, and drive them to a website where you can even take them all the way through, quote unquote, purchasing your product, except at the last minute, you can say, hey, the product's not ready, please register, sign up, and we'll let you know when the product is ready. So let's take an example of a test that Pioneer Square Labs did sometime recently with a product called Xylo, which was a marketplace for musicians to provide classes, to train other people. As you can see here, they actually, did Instagram ads, Facebook ads, Google ads to promote their service, and they actually tracked different value, different messaging, as you can see in the Google ads on the slide, and they tracked different keywords, etc. They spent about, literally about $90,000 to acquire people to come to their site and register. And then they did some simple math to estimate the amount of revenue that they could generate. So they made some estimates as to what percentage of registered users would become paying customers, and then what commission they would get from the sale of the music lessons. And they estimated that they would earn only $21,000 on a customer acquisition cost of $90,000. So clearly the math didn't work out, and they killed that test. with the music lesson service. So Pioneer Square Lab, you may know, is one of the well-known incubators in Seattle, and they test out hundreds of ideas before they go actually build an actual product. So, they've, I think, spun out about 25 different, companies, but they have tested out hundreds of different ideas in the real, market without really writing a single line of code. So that's something, again, I would highly recommend that you do before you actually build out your prototype or build out your MVP. So let's talk about the process of building your MVP. As you all know, the lean product methodology has become very popular, and the notion of building something that is barely functional, that you can get in front of customers and then iterate based on their feedback, is something that's well known. But what this diagram here illustrates is that you really have to think about different layers of functionality of a product. How much functionality you provide, how reliable it is, how usable it is, and then how quote unquote delightful is a product. And what an MVP doesn't mean that you simply provide 30% of the functionality and don't worry about reliability, usability, etc. You really have to make sure that you are addressing the key pain points that the customer has articulated, and that you're delivering a product that is highly usable and reliable. And then once you have provided the key functionality, then you can iterate on the product over time to provide more functionality to the end customer based on the feedback that you're getting and the usability of the product within the customer environment. And then as you are iterating with your product, you need to track a number of key engagement and retention metrics. On the engagement front, clearly you need to track your daily active users and monthly active users. One of the metrics that a lot of startups track is the ratio of daily active users to monthly active users. And typically you want to see a ratio at least of 20-30%. If you get to 50% daily active over monthly active, then you have a world-class product like Facebook, which gets to 60-70% daily active over monthly active ratios. But really, if there's one metric that you need to track, that metric is retention. And the way that you track that metric is through understanding your daily cohorts of users. So you track literally how many users you get on day 0. If you get 100 users on day 0, how many are coming back on day 1, and then over time, how many coming back on day 7, how many coming back on day 30. And what you need to shoot for is what I call a 40-20-10 rule, which is that on day 1, 40% of your users need to be coming back, day 7, 20%, and then day 30, 10%. And if you achieve that level of retention, then you can be a top 5,000 app. If you're assuming you're building a mobile application, and you can see in this chart the different retention curves based on whether you're a top 5,000 app or top 100 app or top 50 app. The retention gets better and better over time. And so it's really important for you to track your retention, because the more users you retain, the bigger your install base. The bigger your install base, the more opportunity that your install base has to spread word of mouth for your application, and the more growth that you're going to see with your application. The other way that you can also track how well you're doing in terms of achieving product market fit is to ask your end customers how they would feel if they could no longer use the product. And if the percentage of people who are saying that they would be very disappointed is greater than 40%, that means that you have achieved product market fit. If it is anywhere between 25 to 40%, then you not achieve product market fit, and you need to kind of either reposition the product or target different market segment. Literally tweak your product so that you can achieve product market fit. However, if you are getting less than 25%, saying very disappointed, then really it requires a major pivot, and you need to keep your burn low as you're iterating and pivoting your product. Let me discuss now a case study with OfferUp, which I talked about briefly before. It's a Seattle-based startup that is providing a marketplace for secondhand goods, which was a market that was dominated by Craigslist in the past. They're now a top 50 app in the App Store and one of the few unicorns in Seattle, really the only direct-to-consumer unicorn in the Seattle area. They've raised over $300 million in funding. So it's very interesting. I know the founders of OfferUp quite well. It's interesting to note that they actually floundered for the first two years. Couldn't really establish a critical mass of users, which is essential, to really create a thriving marketplace. It's only when Facebook, provided mobile ad targeting for the first time by zip code in 2013 that they were able to finally create a marketplace in Seattle. So what they did was they targeted their advertising specifically to the Seattle area to create a mini marketplace in the Seattle Bellevue area. And then they made it super easy from a mobile phone to post used items, which drove the inventory of used items on their marketplace. And then unlike Craigslist, where the only way of communicating with the seller was through email, which was often delayed, they provided in-app messaging, which really drove a strong engagement between the buyers and sellers. And once they proved that this concept worked in the Seattle area, then they were able to go to the VC community, raise enough money to then expand into 3 other markets, and prove that they could take the playbook from Seattle successfully into other markets, prove their concept in markets like Portland and other nearby markets, and then eventually expanded nationwide by raising even more venture capital money. The other thing I want to emphasize here is achieving product market fit is really the first step. You also have to achieve product business model fit. You have to prove that you can actually build a business model that is successful. For example, as we discussed before, that your LTV, lifetime value to customer acquisition cost, is at least 3 to 5x. I'll give an example of Limoca, which, as I discussed, achieved product market fit spectacularly. We grew to 100,000 users within 3 months, 1 million in 1 year, and then 15 million in 3 to 4 years. However, we struggled to monetize effectively because a large majority of our customers came from international audience where there was low penetration of credit card. This was in the 2007 to 2010 timeframe. And it's only years later that Duolingo, which followed Limoca, was able to monetize successfully because they were able to ride the coattails of the App Store, where the App Store provided the mechanism to collect credit cards, and then you could charge for your application. So Duolingo today is getting about a 3% conversion, which is pretty good. They're doing about $200 million of revenue on a user base of about 300 million users. and they recently, went IPO, which many of you may be familiar with that. They had a fairly successful IPO recently. The last thing I want to talk about is the process of making a pivot. Generally, I recommend that you work on your initial concept for a good 3 to 4 months, and then if you're not getting the kind of retention that I talked about, the 40-20-10 rule, then it's time for you to pivot and try something different. We've all heard about this example of Instagram. Originally, it was a location sharing app called Bourbon. They were, I think, a late entrant in the space. Foursquare and Gowalla and others were in the market well before Bourbon. What they discovered was that people were really using the app to share photos and applying filters to make their photos look better. And they decided to get out of the location sharing space and pivot to a much more simple application that was focused, purely on photo sharing. And the rest is history. They grew very rapidly from there on, and then they were featured in the App Store, which drove further their downloads and so forth. So I think that's pretty much covers my presentation on how to achieve product market fit. To kind of summarize what I discussed before, a critical thing for you to do is really to target markets that are going through disruption, whether it's through a global macro trend or through a technology evolution or platform shift. Those are your best opportunities. I would highly recommend that you conduct customer interviews to really understand customer pain points, and then actually test your concept through Google Ads or Facebook Ads. See if you can acquire customers inexpensively, and whether they're resonating with your value proposition. And then I would recommend building out an MVP and then iterating through that process. So with that, hope you found this presentation useful. I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Can you dive a little bit more into the process of how you see people running those early experiments in the first 3 months? What do they need to do to focus in and take action early on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I highly recommend that you start with a very narrow customer base and target that customer base through Google or through Facebook advertising. We talked about the example of OfferUp, for example, where instead of introducing OfferUp throughout the US, they decided to first focus on the Seattle market, right? And so they advertised on Facebook using their zip code advertising, and they were able to acquire customers fairly inexpensively. So that's what I would recommend is deciding who your target customer segment is, and then using advertising to, or if you have a sales team, to go after that specific customer base, and then iterating with your product.
Samir had a question.
All right. Samir, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I didn't have a question. I just applauded, that's all.
Oh, okay. Thank you for your applause.
So I'd like to ask a question, if it's okay.
Please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So there was an article in Harvard Business Review, I think in 2019, that said that product market fit actually penalizes investors. And the example they start with, of course, is that old well-known saying from Henry Ford, that if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, because they had no concept of what the automobile was. And the Harvard Business Review article actually says, if I remember this right, it says a product market fit really makes you look more in terms of refinements over what people already know, rather than something that's really a breakthrough idea. And I noticed all of your examples are simple refinements. First there was Lotus 1-2-3 and then became Excel. Well, that's a refinement. Same with OfferUp, same with Live Mocha. These are all things that people already know, and you're just talking about making a refinement rather than a truly breakthrough idea, which they're not going to be able to help you with. So I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts about how this would actually hurt the investment community, because it keeps you away from breakthrough ideas.
Can you name a breakthrough idea that you want to use as a foil?
Do I have a breakthrough idea that I could use?
Yeah, it's a place starting point so that we distinguish.
Like 23andMe is a great example. Sorry to butt in, but
yeah. Well, obviously, Body Guide is a good example. So there are heart failure patients. They've never seen an anklet. That's not a refinement. That's a true breakthrough technology that lets a heart failure patient monitor their fluid retention. And you're not going to really find anyone who can help you with this concept of product market fit. It just doesn't exist. And if you were to try to follow that model, you'd be out doing things like smart scales. Let's just get people to use something they already know, and make that slightly better. And the better mousetrap is not the way to maximize investor return.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good point that you make. I would still say that understanding customer pain points is super important. So in your example of, if you ask customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. The way that you conduct an interview with your customer is not to ask them what solution they want. The way to conduct the customer interview is to ask them what is their problem, right? So if the customers say, hey, in order to get from my farm to town, it takes me 2 hours on horseback. I would like to get there fast. I'd like to get there faster. That gets you to the core issue of what is the pain point that they're suffering, and then you can present them a solution that is say, hey, what if instead of going on a horseback, I could build you a buggy that was a motorized buggy that could travel at 30 miles an hour faster, faster than that could travel faster than a horse, or is more reliable than a horse, didn't have to be fed every day. Maybe that would get you to a breakthrough solution. So I'm not entirely convinced that and it may be a very hit or miss. The risk of not interviewing customers is that it could be a hit or miss situation where you might have one breakthrough product out of 100, right? That's lucky enough to kind of hit the mark. So I think you run a tremendous amount of risk if you're not at least really spending time understanding your customers' problems and having a deep understanding of that problem set.
I see a comment by Himanshu in the chat. Could you also provide some insight on the ideation phase? Should we pick an industry, customer segment, and geography, and then understand the market and discovering customer issues, etc.?
Yeah. Should we pick an industry, customer, and then understand the market and discovering? Yes, I highly recommend that you pick a narrow customer segment first and really understand the problem that they're facing and solve that problem. We've seen time and time, example of Facebook, for example. They first solved the problem for Harvard, then they went to other universities, and once they were successful in other universities, then they open it up, to the general market. So generally, I'm a big fan of doing that, because your product development, your marketing messaging, all of that is highly aligned in solving a specific need. Of course, you should keep an eye out for the longer term and make sure you're architecting a solution so it does not preclude you from serving other markets. So build your solution in your architecture rather in a general purpose way, but focus initially on a narrow customer segment.
So I think part of what he's looking for is understanding where to look to find the sub segment that's in pain. That's good enough. So,
right. So I think that for that, you may need to obviously interview customers in different customer segments and discover where the need is the greatest and the dissatisfaction with existing solutions is the greatest, or where they're hacking together solutions that you can replace with your technology.
Thank you.
So Stephen also asked a question in the chat.
Okay, Stephen's question is, what if you see innovative companies solving a problem with a similar strategy, but early adopters aren't aware of the strategy or how to execute your strategy? Stephen, can you elaborate further on your question? Do you mind unmuting yourself?
Yeah, so if you see there's a trend happening in an industry where innovators are solving a problem in a very similar way, but when you go and you interview the early adopters and the other segments, they don't even understand the strategy when these other companies are effectively executing this strategy. Does that make sense?
And so what is your question though?
So how do you find product market fit? How do you do those customer interviews if they don't even know that the problem exists? You talked about going out and asking, finding 25 people to interview.
Right.
And if you interview some people in the early adopters, they say, hey, we understand this problem. They all have the same problem, but they're like, hey, this strategy is only being adopted by the innovators, and the other early adopter segments don't understand that strategy exists or how to execute that strategy when you're trying to find product market fit.
That would, again, I keep going back to the notion of understanding the pain points. So the first order of business is really to understand, what pain point exists, how deep is that pain point, how actively somebody is solving that pain point. And that should be something that is consistent across the board. You should find that to be consistent across the board, because if it's not consistent across the board, then that should tell you something about the market, that maybe the market is not big enough, right? That it's only, the reason the quote unquote early adopters are adopting it only is because there is a narrow segment of the market that has the problem, and it's not replicating, the problem is not replicating itself to a broader marketplace. So that should kind of tell you something about the market and whether you should enter the market in the first place.
So you can understand or find product market fit by identifying trends, essentially. Then even if the customer interviews doesn't really work for your specific business, you can do it by identifying different trends that are going on and trying to help accelerate those trends.
Yeah, either if the trend allows you to build a solution in a unique way that is vastly superior to existing solutions. So we talked about today the trend with remote work, or the fact that now AI/ML is being widely available as a technology platform, right? And now you can build prediction, etc., that allows you to build a better solution, more intelligent applications. that's a trend that you can take advantage of and service the needs of service existing problems with a better solution.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? We spend a lot of time working on the customer discovery phase of the 4 Steps to Epiphany by Steve Blank in our open coffees on Tuesday morning, where we talk about how to form a hypothesis, how to run an experiment, how to make bite-sized discoveries.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time trying to get people to focus on getting to cash flow positive fastest, not necessarily getting to biggest market soonest, as a way of doing a bottom-up process. Your experience has essentially been what I would call top-down businesses, where you get the idea, you light the fire, they get big really fast, take lots of money, and poof, you have a thing. Can you think about what it would take for people who are trying to discover their sub-markets to succeed in finding the sub-market that works best for them? And what would you advise them as being the best first market?
Yeah, so the variety of ways that you can identify the sub-markets, but one is through customer interviews, understanding, as I said, where the problem definition is the deepest, the problem is the most severe. That's one way. Another way, is, as I described earlier, is to do ad testing, and on Facebook, for example, you can test different customer segments and see where the value proposition is resonating the strongest. You can also understand your customer acquisition cost. It may be that your customer acquisition cost in a certain segment is a lot lower than other segments, and so that means that there is a specific problem there, and the value proposition is resonating, which is why customers are clicking through more for that segment. So those are some of the techniques that you can use to target a sub-segment and decide which one you want to target. Somebody had a question about, let me go back here in the chat window.
Yeah, there's a lot of me typing in there.
Okay.
So that's not really questions.
No, somebody had a question, I think, about difference between consumer versus enterprise. I would say that the one main difference, one thing I want to emphasize between consumer versus enterprise. In consumer, it's very easy to determine retention and engagement and so forth. If you build a mobile application, for example, it's very easy to track those metrics and see how you're doing. With enterprise customers, people make the mistake that if the customer, if you do a POC, a proof of concept, when the customer is doing a trial, that if you get some marquee names and they decide to, buy a product, that equates to success. I would argue that just like the consumer products, that even with enterprise products, you need to track engagement, you need to track retention with the end customer, because if you don't have good engagement, good retention, ultimately the customer will, even though they decided to buy the product because the decision maker is somebody different than the end user, what will ultimately happen is that the customer will churn away because the end users are not really using the product. They'll discover eventually that the product is not really resonating within the enterprise. So what I'm emphasizing here is to treat enterprise products like consumer products and really make sure that the end user is actually using the product and there's good retention, good engagement, good usage, and not relying on the fact that the customer has made a purchase decision to say, okay, I'm successful and I should, keep going.
Other questions from folks? Michael Irving, you want to throw in some oysters here?
Michael Murphy?
I was actually late because I was selling, John.
Nothing like getting your funding from customer revenue. Anybody have any other questions they want to ask?
Yeah, I just posted one up in the chat
Yeah.
about customers being opportunists rather than like necessarily seeking out solutions for a specific problem.
Right. They just want the pain to go away. They're not necessarily sure what the pain is caused by.
Right. Well, it's like somebody's like, you hear about something from a friend and you're like, oh yeah, that's something I could use. And so you discover a product that you'd be happy to adopt, but which you didn't know you were looking for a solution for that. You didn't even know that was a problem you cared about. It's just something that can make your life better. And I'm not sure that like doing interviews that are asking, potential customers of the market what your problems are going to like reveal those opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that the pattern that you're naming is a pattern for the majority, the early and late majority. Follow that pattern. Early adopters are seekers of novelty, and they actually have opinions about what hurts in a way that's different than the early majority, right?
But that sort of assumes that they kind of are aware of everything that's out there. And so sometimes like describing a problem versus presenting a solution,
Right.
gives a different impression.
So in the very beginning of the early adopter or in the customer discovery phase, part of the question is, what do you do now about it? And what don't you like about what you do now? And you build a detailed competitive matrix. And so that process of building actually, here's all the things that people are doing, and you go find out what the best of the best is, and it's still not enough for most people, then that helps you discover that, right? Not a cursory alternative list, but a detailed list of, you talk to 100 people and you get lots of different choices of the things that they tried and why they didn't like them. I see a note from Himanshu in the chat.
Is it possible that a product that did not find product market fit in the past suddenly finds product market fit when conditions change? I think this is happening to many products during COVID. Yeah, so as I described earlier, when there is a new trend or a new technology, whatever, those are some of the best opportunities for you to take advantage of. And it is certainly possible that there are products that are ahead of their time in that the trend was not around or the technology was not around, and that made the product fail. And eventually you find the right trend or the right technology that makes your product successful. So that's certainly, I mentioned the example of Live Mocha. We ultimately had to sell to Rosetta Stone because we couldn't monetize. And Duolingo came later on, and they wrote the monetization made available through the App Store, right? If Live Mocha if we had successful monetization, we would have been able to raise more VC funding, and that would have allowed us to continue growing very rapidly, and Duolingo would not have happened. But the need was there for language learning, and Duolingo came on the scene many years after we did, and they were successful because the mobile penetration had increased dramatically in different countries around the world, and people had access to credit cards and so forth. So that's a great example of technology that succeeded eventually, whereas we didn't quite succeed.
So Warren posted something about the entrepreneur's handbook. How crisis is contemporary, amplify your product. Deborah is asking, word of mouth and referrals or target approach to social media. Is there data that shows which gets better traction?
My experience has been that word of mouth is really critical to success. It can be amplified with social media, but if you don't have intrinsic word of mouth for your product, that it's not going to be a very successful product. Certainly, as I said, you can amplify it on social media, but it has to be, and word of mouth is a function of retention, which is what I mentioned earlier. The stronger the retention, the more shallow the retention curve, the bigger your installed base and more opportunity for word of mouth to happen for your product, and more growth will result from the word of mouth.
Right. If you're remarkable, then people comment on you, then social media can amplify that process.
Yeah.
It's like doing a Kickstarter campaign with nobody who cares about you, and then you don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts that people have? I want Praveen to ask a question about his restaurant helping thing, but he's not responding to my poke. All right. So, Shirish, thank you very much for coming and helping us with this. I know that you're part of SAC this round, so
Yeah.
we're going to discover a lot more about startups as we go through this. We have a talk which is on Thursday, which is about patient engagement from the patient perspective. We're running some health-oriented ones every month in the SAC series. We will split the education program for the APIS Health program onto Thursday evenings starting in September. So the first one of those will be September 9th. And so if you are not engaging, or if you have an interest in health-oriented ones, you'll want to go to the APIS Health Angels site and sign up for the workshops there. We will continue with the Thursday noon workshops all through the fall. And our goal is to help startups get to be more fundable and be more effective. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so very much, Shirish, for being our speaker today. I really appreciate it.
That's great. Thank you for all the great questions, and looking forward to the Seattle Angel Conference soon.
Thank you. We
Thank
will
you, Shirish.
have recorded this, and so we'll put it up on the YouTube channel. If you have missed some of our workshops, you might want to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you so very much.